Greeting from Virginia, the mother of all American states, and welcome to this hopefully promising panel discussion on the regional rivalry in Lebanon. We thank Carnegie Endowment for leaving the best to the last, and welcome to the turbulent waters of the Middle East. Since the war began in Lebanon in 1975, most of the neighborhood got involved in the Lebanese conflict, and countries beyond the neighborhood, from the United States to France to other, got involved in the Lebanese conflict. Most of these states that got involved in Lebanon, including the two neighboring states, Syria and Israel, were humbled and or embarrassed at one time or another, including the Israelis and the Syrians, who sent conventional forces and visited Lebanon with tremendous amount of violence. We will discuss the role of foreign powers in Lebanon, but let me first introduce the panel. One reason I agreed to do this panel is because we have a stellar number of people. They happen to be friends, but they happen to be also excellent scholars. Let me introduce them quickly. Kim Ghattas is a visiting fellow of the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Beirut. She is the author of a number of books, including a wonderful book that should be must read for everybody interested in Lebanon and in the region, Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East. Then we have Emil Hukayim, who's joining us from London. He's a senior fellow for Middle East security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Emil published widely on Gulf security issues and on the Syrian conflict. And then we have Ziad Majid, a fellow bluesman. He's an associate professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the American University of Paris, and he's the author of several books on Iran and Syria. Unfortunately, we couldn't have Randa Slim, who was supposed to join us from Sicily, where she went there to revive Arab claims to that island. For technical reasons, we will be deprived of her contribution. We are not going to have opening remarks. I will raise a question or two or a theme or two, and then we hope to have a free-flowing, no-holds-bar conversation. Everything is allowed. Let me start by the proposition, the following proposition. Since everybody is talking about a French role, and we've seen the French president involved directly in the Lebanese affairs since the peaceful uprising of 2019. Macron met with everybody in Lebanon, the president, the prime minister, and Fayrouz and others. And we've seen that his efforts were resisted mightily by some Lebanese groups. We see Iranian and their allies are doubling down, and then we see a withdrawal of Saudi and other Gulf interests in Lebanon. In fact, the Saudis have washed their hands of Lebanon, or appear to be doing so. But before we discuss what these countries might do in the next year and the year after, let's review quickly the fact that most of the countries that got involved in Lebanon, including the Israelis and the Syrians, were humbled and or embarrassed in Lebanon and found out that their schemes for Lebanon foundered. So let's keep that in mind when we discuss the role of the French and others in the next couple of years. The other theme is the only exception to this rule of the failure of outside parties is Iran. Iran, because of its strategic alliance with Syria and Hezbollah, is still the country with the most influence in Lebanon. And I want to use Iran so that we can talk about Hezbollah, the elephant in the room, because Hezbollah seems to be the main obstacle for any kind of reform. And we've seen Hezbollah, in fact, playing the leading role in aborting the peaceful uprising that began in October in 2019. So with these two themes in mind, let me start with Kim. Kim, you wrote that book on Black Wave. Let's talk a little bit about the Iranian influence in Lebanon and why the Saudis seems to be retrenching and allowing, as many observers would say, of creating more vacuum in Lebanon to be filled precisely by the Iranians.
Thank you very much, Hisham, for these very smart, astute insights into what we're looking at in Lebanon and how regional rivalries play in Lebanon. And I think you're absolutely right that one of the countries that has not been humbled yet is Iran. It is the country, the external force that has been the most successful in utilizing its influence, its proxies, its finances, its power, religious and military, to maintain a foothold in Lebanon, an increasingly strong chokehold also over the country's politics over the last 40 years. And I say so far, I say that has not been humbled yet, because I think that we are in a stage that is a bit of an inflection point. And I think that there is increasing pushback against Iranian influence in Lebanon, but also in Iraq, and perhaps we'll see that in Syria. And so I think that what we're seeing today is a new, I don't want to say a new page opening, but an interesting moment in the country's history and in Iran's influence in Lebanon. That influence in Lebanon expresses itself in various ways, of course, through Hezbollah, but also through Iran's allies. And one of the reasons why Iran is so successful, and Emil will also be very good he's the expert on some of these mechanisms that Iran uses, is that it is methodical, it is consistent, it uses its state influence to run networks, militias, it spends a lot of money, and it works methodically, systematically, and consistently over the duration to maintain these networks. And none of its rivals in the region, or none of its foes, its adversaries, have been able to match that. When you look at the US changing policies every now and then, with every president, there's a slight change in direction, even if the big picture remains the same. Similarly for the French, the British, the Europeans in general. The Russians have been involved differently so far, but increasingly so in Syria. And Iran is also helped by Lebanon's internal dysfunctions, the regional inter-Arab dysfunctions, and the fact that the West often doesn't see eye to eye on issues like Iran or Hezbollah. So Iran and Hezbollah are very much helped by their own methodical approach to things, but also by the dysfunction of others and the lack of coordination between allies. But I think it's important to point out that what Iran offers is not exactly something that most or a lot of people are going to continue to aspire to, even if others did in the past. I think the project that Iran offers for the region is one littered with chaos and to some extent misery and corruption, whether it's Lebanon, Iraq, or Syria, or Yemen. But you asked me specifically about how the rivalry plays out and whether the Saudis have washed their hands from Lebanon. I think that they did have a moment after the coming to power of King Salman and the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, where there was some petulance in Saudi policy towards the region, whether it was starting a war in Yemen or whether it was walking away from Lebanon and inviting the Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri for a rough visit to Saudi Arabia. I think 4 years down the line, they are rethinking that approach. It's going to take them some time, but I think they have, from my understanding, in some of my conversations, accepted that they have ceded the ground in some of these places, be it Yemen, Syria, or Lebanon, or helped to some extent helped Iran to gain more ground. Are we seeing Saudi re-engagement in Lebanon just because Macron went to Saudi Arabia and met with Mohammed bin Salman? My understanding is that they are sending a chargé back to Lebanon. Is that re-engagement? I'm not sure. I think it's better than no engagement. I'm the one who wrote the book about how the Saudi-Iran rivalry brought a lot of destruction and chaos to the region. But I also think that when the Saudis are not engaged at all in regional conversations, that also provokes an unbalance. I think we'll have to see what President Macron was able to get in terms of promises. He's tried before. He hasn't been able to deliver on the promises that he made to the Lebanese. And we'll have to see how much room to maneuver everyone has going forward. I'm not going to say optimistic, because I think Lebanon still has a rough time ahead, but I think something is shifting.
All right, thank you, Kim. These are wonderful observations. Let me move to Ziad. You and I discussed on the phone the role of Iran. It seems to me that Iran, a country with 4,000-year history, a great pre-Islamic history, and also a great Islamic history, Iran mastered what we call, historians call, the long game, and that's what I think Kim was referring to. None of the Gulf states have these long game, capabilities, and we've seen that the Americans don't have that patience, that strategic patience that the Iranians have. Not even the French, although the French probably claim otherwise. Talk a little bit about this void that the Saudi disengagement and even the American disengagement, because in Washington we don't see serious American attention to Lebanon. We see the only American attention to Lebanon is through the Lebanese armed forces. They believe that by supporting this institution, that's the utmost that they could do. That leaves the Iranians as the only players in Lebanon. But at the same time, we've seen that the Iranians have been dealt a serious blow by the Iraqi elections, and I think Kim alluded to the growing disenchantment within the Shia community in Lebanon of Hezbollah and Iran, as we've seen the disenchantment of the Shia in Iraq vis-a-vis their Iran proxies and Iran in Iraq.
Yes, thank you, Hisham. Well, let me say first that I agree with Kim that part of the Iranian power in the region is the fact that many of its foes or of its rivals, its enemies, do not have the same consistent policy and the same work that tries to bring in ideology, financial capacity, pragmatic positions, in addition to multiplying the alliances, and sometimes to have alliances at the same time with rival local camps in each of the countries where Iran is involved. What makes Iran different in Lebanon, in my opinion, is in addition to the fact that it has invested a lot in Lebanese affairs since 1982, since the Israeli invasion, and then since the arrival of the Revolutionary Guards to the Bekaa Valley, based on the Syrian-Iranian cooperation or alliance during the Gulf War between Iraq and Iran. Iran has been, since the 80s, building institutions, networks, going from charity to hospitals, to dispensaries, to scouts, to military, of course, forces, has both loyalties, has created a very strong presence in the country that at the same time has an ideology, Wilayat al-Faqih, at the same time is extremely pragmatic, regardless of the ideology, and is investing in the vertical divisions in the Lebanese society, in sectarian politics, but allowing its local ally, Hezbollah, to be flexible, capable of moving through the lines, of taking all advantages from the weaknesses, from the vulnerability of its rivals and its foes. And Iran, in that sense, which is different also from other important actors, whether Saudi Arabia or you mentioned Syria or Western forces, does have today a very solid social basis within the Shia community, and does have at the same time allies outside that community, and more important maybe, does have a very powerful and disciplined political party that has participation in the parliament, in the government, and does have its own army capable of intervening in Lebanon, but also outside Lebanon, as we have seen mainly in Syria. So all of this gives Iran, and since you mentioned the 4,000 years of civilization, even if I'm sure you didn't mean that they are today using them, but in a way, this DNA of an empire is somewhat we can talk about it through this Iranian will, let's say, to create a territory of influence, of direct control that goes from Tehran to Baghdad, to Damascus, to Beirut, reaching thus the Mediterranean on the one hand, having the border with Israel accessible as well, in order to retaliate to the Israelis when it comes to the nuclear issue or to other issues. And that gives the Iranians lots of cards, lots of capacities to negotiate in each one of those theaters of operation, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. And even if sometimes they are challenged or they are threatened, like we can see that in Iraq today by the Shia community of Iraq itself and by many citizens in Iraq, they can still negotiate, they can still use other tools. Sometimes it could be purely political, sometimes it could be combined with violence, sometimes it could be through maneuvers that will bring in other actors with whom they kept always some possibilities and some potential contacts and alliances. We can see it in Syria as well, where they have purchased land, they have an important presence, and even if the Russians would like to let's say, marginalize them a bit or pretend that Russia is monopolizing the political control and the military presence in the country, I'm not sure that Iran will accept that or will deal with that by lots of compromises. They know how powerful they are. They do also still control some militias from Iraq and from the Hazara of Afghanistan. They do have inside the Syrian institutions important presence. And if we talk about Lebanon, one of the comparative advantages of Iran, if we will bring in other actors from the region or beyond, is also the fact that many today forces in Lebanon, in other communities, have Hezbollah as a model. Many of those who are opposed to Hezbollah from sectarian basis or due to sectarian concerns would love to be like Hezbollah or are trying to become mini Hezbollahs. And I think this is a typical mistake in these kind of situations when we try to identify to the other, to the one that we consider to be more powerful, in order to compete with them, in order to try to show some signs of strength that we initially don't need to have if we are talking about a serious alternative and if we are talking about constructing another model that will weaken Hezbollah, or at least that will give Hezbollah the space that it should deserve, not more, and especially not through imposing it by force. So to conclude on that, and just I will finish here, I think that Iran today, it's true, is challenged in Iraq. It's true, it might be challenged in Syria. And in Lebanon, there are more and more voices against Hezbollah and its regional alliance. But I don't see Iran really threatened as the superpower in the region, because neither Saudi Arabia, nor the United Arab Emirates, nor Turkey, that has other priorities, are into challenging it. Not to talk, of course, about the Saudis, who are becoming less and less, in my opinion, influential on those theaters.
Thank you, Ziad. That's an excellent segue to Emil. The reason I brought the empire, I'm a amateur historian. Thousands of years ago, the Persians fought the Greeks. Persia was at one time a Mediterranean power. So, and I always say, whether the ruler of Iran is wearing a crown or a turban or three-piece suit, he will act as the leader of a country with 4,000-year history, with tremendous influence around it, and a country that would like to, impose its hegemony in its neighborhood. Emil, you lived in the Gulf, you know Gulf societies, Gulf politics. Talk a little bit about how the Saudis and maybe the Emiratis and others explain, if they do explain, their retrenchment from Lebanon. And don't they realize what many Lebanese and observers say, if you retrench from Lebanon, you create the vacuum that only the Iranians that you complain about are likely to fill?
Thank you, Hisham. I would argue not just the Iranians, but possibly the Turks and others who position themselves as the challengers of the Gulf states. If you're sitting in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, you basically look at the northern Middle East, that region from Iraq to to the Mediterranean. And you basically feel like, it's not worth it. The costs of being involved are too high, whether it's the direct costs, the financial one, the political one, the reputational one, and that the returns are simply not there. And there is a lot of frustration that comes from this. It's a very, if you are Saudi, you basically have worked with possibly everyone in Lebanon, including at one point the Iranians, where there was decent coordination with the Syrians. You've reached out to every Lebanese political party. You poured money into the central bank. You made promises, and at times you put money into the security forces. You've reached out to religious leaders. And yet you realize after all this time that your own national security interests cannot be met in Lebanon. And it's a very bitter moment for Saudi elites. I mean, it's very important to understand that much of Saudi Arabia's engagement in the Middle East was in Lebanon. Was not just strategic and political, it was emotional. In a way, they looked at this place where a number of senior Saudis had grown up or went to school or had married and would spend their holidays, and they felt in a way an emotional and cultural attachment to the place. And to come...
But true before Mohammed bin Salman.
That was true, exactly.
I remember discussing with Saud al-Faisal exactly what you're saying. He said, look, we have investment in Lebanon, we have friends in Lebanon, we have traditions in Lebanon, we have relations with Lebanese, but the new crop of leaders in Lebanon, the younger ones, they don't know Lebanon, they don't know Beirut, they don't have friends in Lebanon, they don't know the Mashriq.
Well, that's what
their parents did.
That's what I was getting at, Hisham. There has been generational change in the Gulf region that many Lebanese didn't necessarily appreciate. That new generation, whether it's in Saudi, in the UAE, I would argue in Oman, in Qatar, in Kuwait, doesn't have the same attachment to Lebanon. Doesn't, in a way, Lebanon's importance was inflated in the heads of previous leaders because it was, Lebanon had politics and it had television. So if you're sitting in the Gulf, you look at it and it's entertainment. And now it's no longer entertainment. It's much more of a frustration. The level of interest in the region has dropped massively. The Gulf states have access to the talent from across the region and across the world. The Lebanese no longer have that special place with the Palestinians and Egyptians and so on. When the Gulf states were going through their national development processes, so in a way they wrote off that. So it takes you to a very difficult place right now because, as Kim has argued, too much Saudi Arabia is a problem. Too little or no Saudi Arabia is perhaps an even bigger problem. And that imbalance that Kim describes is something that is quite clear for Lebanese actors because they grew accustomed to having the attention of someone, and they don't necessarily know how to behave when that attention is absent. They really want to take the plane and go to Riyadh and sit down and talk to a senior prince for hours and convince them that they have the solution, and if only they get the support, they could deliver that. And when that visit is not going to happen, it's hard. It's very hard. Now, for the Gulf states, their issue, contrary to Iran here, is that their project was to build a Lebanese state in which they had influence, where I think the objective for the Iranians was always a more realistic one. They don't care about state building in Lebanon. That's not the objective. The objective is to make sure that you have a security presence that is not that can be challenged. I don't think the Iranians want complete hegemony in Lebanon. They don't want to, oversee economic and social policy in Lebanon. That's not the point. The point is that they want to have, through Hezbollah, a veto on Lebanon's security and foreign policy. It's not about affecting every aspect of Lebanese society. Whereas the Gulf states thought that, we will invest in the state and then we will influence the state. And these are two very different approaches. The problem with Lebanon is it's, as we all know, it's very difficult to build a state because of the political system. The political system itself doesn't allow the building of a state. So the Gulf leaders have started seeing that project as it's a Don Quixote kind of venture. And so that's also why they grew disillusion. It's not just disillusion about the power of Hezbollah or the weakness of Hariri. It's a disillusion with the bigger project of state building that then would carry Gulf influence, Gulf interest. And that's where we are today.
I don't know if they really wanted to build state institutions in Lebanon, but let's put that aside. Kim, now we see attempts by Gulf states to reestablish relationship with Syria, to bring Syria back to the Arab fold, quote unquote. I don't know what that means, and I think it is disaster to bring Bashar's back to give Bashar any kind of respectability or legitimacy. But if they are doing it with a man who waged war against his own people and he used every conceivable weapon in his arsenal against the Syrian civilians, if they are trying to rehabilitate that awful regime, why can't they try to reestablish some influence in Lebanon? Regardless of what Emil was saying, and Emil raised some serious legitimate concerns, and I can see that. But it seems to me that they are conceding easily, and that's why these people have short attention span. And that's why I talk about the 4,000-year history with the long game and the short attention history with these new regimes.
I'll say a few things that will lead to the answer to this question. I'll just pick up on a few things that Emil said as well. I think one of the reasons why, I absolutely agree that, the younger generation of leaders in the Gulf states don't have this emotional attachment to Lebanon. But remember also that their own countries have changed. They don't need to come and party in Lebanon for the summer. They can do it in their own countries. Today in Dubai, you go to Dubai, even to Saudi Arabia, to Kuwait, there is a space that I would not say political freedom, but there is a certain social freedom that they did not used to have. And so Lebanon as an emotional place also becomes less relevant because of that. When it comes to their investment in Lebanese politics and the fact that they feel that they didn't get the return on investment, I think they have to ask themselves very hard questions about what they invested in. You can criticize the Iranians for the influence they have in Lebanon and why they serve only one community or why they drive a certain worldview, but they invest in institutions, in hospitals, in hospitals, in schools, etc. And I would like to see an audit of this supposed $70 billion that the Saudis sent to Lebanon over the last few decades. And I can guarantee you that a lot of it is sitting in the bank accounts of politicians, which is not a way to do any state building. And I also think it's very important that while we discuss regional rivalries, we need to also address our own failings in Lebanon, because we have a tendency to say, well, the Saudis didn't come, or the Americans didn't come, or the Americans didn't do this. The Americans are only focused on the Lebanese army. And I think it's very important that as we have these conversations about how regional rivalries play out in Lebanon, we also make sure that those listening, the audience this evening and so on, realize or don't forget that a lot of our problems are also our own to fix. It's not all about the regional rivalry. When it comes to Syria and renewed Arab engagement with Bashar al-Assad, the Saudis are still very hesitant about it. Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, the UAE foreign minister, traveled to Damascus. That was, the biggest embrace, if you will. And the Jordanians are sort of somewhere in between, where they're being very pragmatic about the fact that what they have done, what the Arab world has done over the last 10 years is not working. Bashar al-Assad is still there. So what do you do going forward? And I totally agree that Bashar al-Assad should, have his day in court, in international court, for war crimes and probably genocide and crimes against humanity. But Arab leaders, what I'm describing is the reality today, which is that Arab leaders, or some of them, have decided that there is no way forward if we're going to do it through an international court of justice, and that perhaps a short-term engagement to at least resolve some issues that are of national security interest to them, like the border between Jordan and Syria, refugees, etc., is one way forward. And for the Egyptians and the Jordanians, it's also a way of re-engaging in the Arab or re-engaging Syria in the Arab conversation and not ceding the ground fully to Iran. I think that for once they're going into this with their eyes wide open. I don't think anyone has any illusion that they can peel Syria away from Iran, but at least they can be part of the conversation. And why engage with Syria but not with Lebanon? I think that was a short power play, a diplomatic spat that was used for this by the Saudis to get something, and that something was the first visit by a Western leader to Saudi Arabia since the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. That was a very short-term tactical play. They had no other cards to play to get this this recognition or this visit or this call by a Western leader. And so short of a visit to the White House or a call from President Biden, they got Macron, and in exchange, they called Miati. But also, look at things, just one last thing, Hisham. You know, reconstruction in Syria is going to be big business. And I'm sure that some Arab leaders are looking at the possibilities in Syria and thinking they're much more interesting than in Lebanon, probably.
Yeah, there is something else that I call these Arab regimes. They constitute a confederacy of autocratic leaders. And that's why in the end, they would live with someone like Bashar, with his bloody history. They lived with Omar al-Bashir, they lived with Saddam, they lived with Ali Abdullah Saleh, and all of that. But that's another topic. Ziad, let me go to you because you are living in France. And let's talk a little bit about the French role and a little bit about the future. Is Macron naive, or does he have a long game here? What can be done in Lebanon? To go back to Hezbollah, what can be done in Lebanon? Is the issue having the elections on time? Is the issue forming a government? Is the issue some economic reform, not serious, but you know, on the surface? Because you cannot do anything substantive in Lebanon unless Hezbollah is involved. And nobody, and Hezbollah so far acts as the victor and everybody else as the vanquished. Yep. And they are not willing to entertain serious reform, serious sharing of power. They don't want to be in charge of Lebanon and control it openly, explicitly, as Kim rightly said so, and I think also Emil. But they want to play the game of the non-state actor, not to be responsible, but act in a way as the final arbiter of decision-making in Lebanon. If there is no group in Lebanon or outside Lebanon willing or capable of standing up to this immovable object called Hezbollah, what can be done with Hezbollah, realistically?
Yep.
Other than complaining as we are.
Absolutely. Before trying to answer or to address this question, allow me just 2 comments on the normalization with Syria that is taking place. I join you by saying that all of those regimes do prefer impunity to a criminal like Bashar al-Assad, because they are directly concerned also with possible impunity due to other crimes they have committed, even if it is not comparable to the mass murder that took place in Syria and to the crimes against humanity in which the regime and its allies were involved. And also to maybe to remind our friends who are listening that the United Arab Emirates never closed its consulate in Syria. It withdrew the ambassador. That Bahrain did not close the embassy, so it was not a return of the ambassador. They kept the diplomatic relations. And Egypt has been trying to play, since the fights in Idlib, few roles in terms of negotiating ceasefires and trying to find something to do. And I think also that not only what was mentioned about Iran, that is important for the Gulf actors, they are mainly obsessed with the Turkish role in Syria, and they want to be in Syria, not to allow Turkey to be the partner of Iran and Russia in shaping the future of the country. In addition, of course, to the reconstruction question with the possible dollars that they can put in order to get more profits later. Now, to go back to Lebanon and to the French initiative, well, I've always asked this question, whether Macron is too naive or he underestimated the resilience of the Lebanese political class. I think that, in fact, the answer could bring them together, or naivety is also underestimation. But I think he made some maybe correct appreciation of the situation. He thought that this political class, even if it's resilient, and even if it has been in power for decades, is now on its knees. The country is in full decline. The society is agonizing. They don't have enough money anymore to continue feeding their networks of corruption. So maybe they will accept few reforms, even if they are cosmetics, in order to get cash, in order to get international support, on the one hand. On the second, France considers itself the only Western actor that is still in touch with the Iranians. They did not boycott the Iranians. They were still in favor of the nuclear deal. They did not put Hezbollah on any terrorist list, contrary to their neighbors in Germany, in Britain, and to the EU that distinguished between the political branch and the military branch. So they thought that through their capacity of talking to everyone, they can bring them into a certain deal, a compromise that will bring in some oxygen to the system before the elections and before modifying or imposing some other reforms through a process of engagement with the IMF, with the World Bank, the EU, and other donors. Now, this didn't work because first the Iranians and Hezbollah were much more waiting for an American move rather than French. So they gained time. They gave the French some positive indications that they are okay with that anyway, they are not involved in the central bank policies, that they will do their best to convince their allies to go into a deal. And they didn't do it. They didn't do it because they were still waiting for Washington to decide what it is going to do. And it was the time of the American elections also. In addition to that, what was problematic with Macron is that he thought as well playing a role in Lebanon due to the historical ties would become something that he can use internally in France in a year that is going to witness the French elections. The French has a certain symbolic attachment to Lebanon for different reasons, historical, Francophonie, Christian presence, their missions there, etc. A success in Lebanon would deliver in foreign policy an image that Macron can realize something that other leaders have not been capable of achieving or of realizing. And maybe another concern, France thought that a reconstruction of the port of Beirut will give it an important role in the Eastern Mediterranean, where already Russia has a military basis in Tartus, Latakia, etc., where Turkey is very active, where Israel, of course, is active. And if you look at Libya, where France and Turkey are also in a confrontation, mainly because of that geostrategic location of Libya in the Mediterranean, we can also understand that France has an interest in being very present in the country. But all that didn't work. There are today some aspirations that elections might change the balance of power. I don't believe, honestly, that this will be the case. But anyway, Macron now, through this move to Riyadh, gave bin Salman a possibility to consider himself welcome again in the international scene. Maybe this is not yet enough, but at least he thought that this might bring him to renew with Lebanon and to help the Sunni community, if we put it like that, reorganizing itself before the elections so that Hezbollah will not win big time once again, at least in some of the electoral districts.
Emil, talk a little bit about the future of Hezbollah and what can be done to engage Hezbollah and or contain Hezbollah in Lebanon that are, in a way realistic, other than just say let's get rid of Hezbollah or let's allow Hezbollah to have total hegemony.
Well, thank you for the easiest of questions. I mean, look, in some ways, Hezbollah's influence has reached its ceiling in Lebanon. I mean, very clearly in the past couple of years, since the October 2019 uprising, and in the past 2 years with the explosion, with Hezbollah trying to frustrate the investigation, with the events of Tayouni and Badaho and so on. I mean, it's very clear that Hezbollah politically is not the comfortable actor it used to be. And you can tell this by just listening to the rhetoric of the leadership. On the defense, very often a lot more aggressive. But even then, I would argue that Hezbollah knows that it's still on strong ground. It's unlikely that the elections will shatter its electoral popular base. There will be fragmentation in other communities. Sadly, in Lebanon, that's how it happens. But probably more fragmentation in the Christian community. There are still big questions about the fate of Hariri and his movement in the next election. So Hezbollah is not that concerned about its own audience. Second, Hezbollah still realizes that it is at the center of any deal making inside the country. The presidential ambitions of every Maronite in the country. Sorry, at this point only 2 or 3, but I suspect every Maronite is born with that crazy ambition in their head. Hezbollah is.
I gave up that ambition years ago.
Lucky you. So Hezbollah is central to that, and it's going to be difficult. Who to side with and on what basis. So certainly at this point. The fact that, for instance, Layman Fangiye, who is one of the contenders, feel that he's owed something because he essentially had his minister let go, George Ardehi, and Hezbollah wants to recognize and reward this. At the same time, Hezbollah still understands that Michel Aoun and his son-in-law, Gebran Bassil, are still major contenders. And so it has to placate them to some extent. And that's, in a way, an impossible choice for Hezbollah. Who do they go for? I think that's really what is going to constrain Hezbollah internally. It's this need to balance between all its interlocutors in other communities. I don't think the primary concern comes from within the community. I think Hezbollah has been quite good in portraying itself as a provider of order or services to its own community as Lebanon essentially erodes. Its message these days is, don't worry, Hezbollah supporters, you'll always be better off than the others because we're present, right? So people have, have become a lot more cynical about what they should expect from the state, what they should expect from others, and this is where Hezbollah is doing a relatively good job. Now, that said, the regional environment is changing. And I would say that, if you are Iran, obviously you feel, in a way, you feel both vindicated and powerful, having survived Trump's maximum pressure campaign and so on. But you still don't see a way out of the current crisis. And it's not as if Iran is all influential. There's this tendency to describe those 4 Arab capitals are being under the complete control of Tehran is a lazy habit that we have. But it's not an accurate reflection. Iran can use coercion or the threat of coercion in those 4 capitals. It can actually derail, if it wants to, any political settlement and so on. But Iran is not all powerful in these places. And
well, I don't want. I mean, what you're saying is essentially fascinating, but I want to go to a different place. Iran is a negative power in these four capitals. It's not a positive power in these 4 capitals. But I think you can argue, and this is for Kim, Hezbollah overextended itself. It expended capital, human capital, financial capital in that grinding war in Syria. They are involved in, at least according to their critics, in drug making, drug dealing. They don't have enough money as they used to. They realize that there is resentment within the community. They look at Iraq and they see that in the election, the anti-Iranian, anti-militia, anti-chaos forces are gaining influence. So I think there are internal contradictions within the world and the universe of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and I think the leadership of Hezbollah would look at the elections in Iraq and say, our elections next year, if they take place, we might see something similar here. And so I want Kim to address this quickly. so that we would leave a few minutes at the end for some Q&A. Go ahead, Kim.
I think that Emil makes a great point that the regional landscape is changing, and that is adding to Iran's concerns. They thought that they would get an easy way back into the nuclear talks, the JCPOA, under the Biden administration, so they waited for a bit, as Ziad said, but that did not happen. I think that they are concerned about the popular pushback that they're seeing in Iraq and Lebanon, but Emil is right that this is not what's going to change the current setup. Ziad also accurately pointed out that we should not expect dramatic change from the elections next year, but I do think that, like in Iraq, we can see some small breakthroughs. And I actually think you might even see it in areas where Hezbollah is present and strong. I mean, I'm hearing about incredible political sort of activism in places like Nabatieh by groups that are not affiliated to Hezbollah. And that's where I want to say something that I think we often forget in these conversations. When, Hisham, we say, Iran is a negative power. It's a negative power depending on where you stand. And I think that for a lot of people that support Hezbollah's worldview, Iran's worldview, Iran is a positive power, or is a power that they look up to. And that includes many people in the Shia community in Lebanon. And I think it's important to remember that when people are devising policies, because if you want to try to convince people in the Shia community who see Hezbollah as their protector, you have to find ways to do that. And I can't speak for the Shia community, I can't speak for all Lebanese, but I think that that's basic policy making. What is it that Hezbollah offers that makes people so loyal? Sometimes it's oppression and it's fear and it's threat of a gun. But it is important to have these conversations and to make sure that when the Saudis reach out to Lebanon, or when Lebanese politicians run for their campaigns, including opposition, the nascent opposition, that they take into consideration that there is a whole community that is often not included in the conversation, because it's assumed that it's this is Hezbollah. And I think we need to move beyond that. And I think that is one of the grave mistakes made by the March 14th camp after 2005, which is to dismiss almost, from my perspective, the Shia community as, Hezbollah can have them. And I just don't think that that's fair. And I can see Ziad raising his hand, and I would love his input on that, because I think sometimes when we discuss these conversations, we tend to stereotype, and it's too monolithic.
Excuse me. When I said Iran is a negative power, Iran is not interested in reforming the Lebanese political system. I think the French would be positive. Maybe the Americans would be positive.
But
other local players would be positive. But Iran is negative, in my view. It's not because it supports the Shia community. I don't look. I mean,
No, but I'm saying we have to look at what people.
No, because you can say. Then this is a communal thing. I don't have a communal approach to Lebanon, unfortunately. Although in Lebanon, they deal with us as members of a community, but not as citizens. We are not citoyens, because I'm a member of the Maronite family, and you're a member of this, or you are a Druze or Shia. But what I meant by a negative power is that Iran essentially is interested in its own, strategic interest. They have Hezbollah, and they treat Hezbollah as a satrap to serve their strategic interest. It doesn't mean that Hezbollah is not legitimate, or it doesn't mean that definitely the Shia community is one of the largest communities in Beirut. And Lebanon's future cannot be determined without their contribution. Obviously, we all agree on that one. All I'm saying is that Iran has a certain regional ambitions, and it's using Lebanon for these regional ambitions. But it's using Lebanese and as cannon fodder, just as they use the Shia in Iraq as cannon fodders, just as other Arabs are using
absolutely. But just
Sudanese and cannon fodders in Yemen.
Hisham,
I mean, we've seen all this.
It's clear. What you wanted to say is clear, but just let me, because Kim made a few remarks, and I think they are extremely important when it comes to the missing opportunities when it comes to dealing with Hezbollah. We had lots of missing opportunities within our Lebanese sectarian system, what we still continue to call the consociational system, requiring always quotas and participation based on the confessional identity. We missed an opportunity in 2000 with the liberation of South Lebanon, and we missed an opportunity in 2005 when we did also have the possibility of addressing Hezbollah's question differently after the withdrawal of the Syrian occupation, and to try to reconcile two great achievements in our modern history: the liberation of South Lebanon from the Israeli occupation and the liberation of the country from the Syrian regime occupation. We missed that opportunity.
True.
Then 2006 was another opportunity. Hezbollah brought us to a war with Israel. However, the national reaction was also very hesitant and didn't understand the moment and what it means for a large part of the Shia community that became under the Israeli fire. We then missed many other, and this is mainly because of sectarian politics, because some people in March 14 considered that all Shia should be under Hezbollah. So we negotiate with Hezbollah and Amal, and we consider that everyone in the Shia community is under them, exactly as they do with their own communities. The Sunnis should be under the Hariri. The Christians are divided between the Lebanese forces own and sometimes the Kata'ib. Jumblat has the monopoly almost among the Druze. So this sectarian mentality did offer community to people, and then they tell them that you are hostages or you have been taken hostage by this group or that group. This is, in fact, more than naive. This is becoming, in a way, in Lebanon, criminal, because if you want to weaken Hezbollah, you do not weaken Hezbollah by opposing to it other sectarian forces with a sectarian discourse and software. You oppose to Hezbollah another model of progressive politics and of reforms. As for the weapons of Hezbollah, this is something that we cannot, unfortunately, deal with in Lebanon. It's an Iranian, regional, and international question.
I agree.
And that is a big burden in Lebanon anyway, a big danger in Lebanon.
Okay. We have some questions here. We have only a few minutes. How do you see the Assad regime role in Lebanon during the next phase? Also, can we separate the Russians and Syrian roles in Lebanon, or will they be the same? That's one. That's one question. While KSA, Saudi Arabia, is now acting in an angry mode in Lebanon, however, the Saudis accelerated the Lebanon collapse by kidnapping Hariri, which caused the outflow of funds. Anyway, the question is cut here. Quick remarks about these two questions. Kim, quickly.
I still have a hard time thinking about a role of the Assad regime in Lebanon. I just think that's not how we should phrase the question. In the coming years, I don't see a role for the Assad regime. I see a role for an alliance of actors that includes Hezbollah, Assad, the Iranians, and how they're going to play their cards and try to maintain their hold on Lebanon. But I don't see what some people describe as the return of the Assad regime in Lebanon. And keep in mind that in some ways, they never really left because they had Hezbollah and their other allies to continue to implement their policies and hold their power in Lebanon. I just want to emphasize the very important points that Ziad made. I mean, this is crucial, and it's something that needs to be part of our conversations when we discuss Lebanon and when we discuss the region. And when it comes to Hezbollah's arms, I mean, in a way, they're not legitimate. Because there should be one Lebanese army, and all arms should be, under the sovereignty of the Lebanese state. And that's what a recent poll shows is the opinion of the majority. So I would assume that Hezbollah is actually quite worried about public opinion and what elections might reveal if they happen, and depending on how they happen. Hezbollah does have a part of the monopoly on arms and violence, which means that it is also able to suppress opposition from within.
Yeah. Okay. I believe it was Max Weber who talked about that the state, only the state, should have the monopoly over arms. This is one of the definitions of sovereignty, is to have one party in a state, which is the army, that has a monopoly on or the state monopoly on the use of force and a monopoly on the use of coercive methods and means, which is only the state. This is the great Max Weber. Anyway, Emil, can you deal with the question about the question concerning Hariri and that the Saudis, with MBS in particular, Mohammed bin Salman, exacerbated the situation in Lebanon by forcing Hariri to resign from Riyadh?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously this was an egregious act back in 2017, and it's and it was in a way the illustration of Saudi frustration with Lebanon. Now, on top of the Lebanese aspect, which is very important, it also illustrate I would say the almost incestuous relationship between the promiscuous promiscuous relationship between Lebanese elites and Gulf elites, in a way that Hariri himself was a Saudi citizen, and so there were specific Saudi expectations of him. I mean, and it didn't help that he was embroiled in financial business troubles in the kingdom, and he himself had privileged relations with a specific part of the Al Saud family. So it shows you that when those relationships are very personalized, sometimes they work very well. But when they sour, their impact is much broader. Now, I would not put the economic collapse of Lebanon. Wouldn't put the blame for the economic collapse of Lebanon on that specific episode. It did illustrate that Saudi Arabia was no longer going to be there for Lebanon, but the issues in Lebanon are much more structural. The corruption, the mismanagement, the central banks games, and so on. These are much more consequential from that perspective. Look, ultimately, the Saudis are disengaging, and I think it's unlikely that they will come back online absent a real, some real returns, which are very unlikely. It's not the French or even the Americans who will be able to produce that. So I think the Saudis, for all intents and purposes, are out of the game for the moment. They will wait for a regional change. It may come back. The Saudi may come back. A detente with Turkey, change in relations with Iran. Perhaps some big development in Iraq and so on. It's not a given, but it's not going to be Lebanese centric. It's not going to be some amazing development inside Lebanon that will bring the Saudis back. It will have to be a change in their own perspective on the region.
Ziad, final comment?
Yes, I agree with what Emil just explained. And the final comment when it comes to Lebanon, once again, it's clear today that there will be no sustainable solution as long as Hezbollah continues to connect the issues in the country with regional considerations and with Iranian priorities. But at the same time, there will be no solution without Hezbollah in Lebanon due to its legitimacy in the Shia community, at least. And the only response to all that is to try to push for reforms in the political system that is becoming obsolete today, reforms when it comes to human rights in the country, reforms when it comes to the electoral system. The vote age in Lebanon is still 21. It should be a real struggle to make it 18. There are lots of questions about decentralization, administrative decentralization, of course, economic and financial reforms, because in these fields, I don't think Hezbollah can have a veto always. They can make some obstacles. They do have some allies that they want to protect, but there are possibilities, or there are, if there is a political will to do things here, while the strategic question of Hezbollah's weapon, that is a real threat on Lebanese security, and for many people, they fear the consequences of these weapons, but I don't think there is a solution without a regional one and without a deal maybe with Iran that would bring this to a certain terms. Otherwise, yeah, it was great listening to all of you. Thank you.
At this somewhat optimistic note, I would say that all good things, including this panel, must come to an end. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Emil. Thank you, Ziad. And thank you, Carnegie, for this wonderful opportunity. We didn't solve the Lebanese problem, but maybe next time we'll do a better job. So from Virginia, goodbye and have a wonderful day. Thank you again.
Thank
Bye.
you all.
Shukran.
Bye.